Spencer, how you doing, man?
Great. How are you, Caleb?
Doing well, doing well. Thanks for joining us for doing this kind of a series of interviews right now that I'm thinking might turn into a podcast at some point too.
Cool.
So we'll see. No, I haven't told anybody that yet, so our listeners are
I'm
just
the first one to know.
that's right. You're the first one to know. So yeah, we'll see about that. If you're watching this right now, leave a comment, and let me know how you feel about that. But yeah, just want to have you on. I'm talking to a bunch of different worship leaders right now, hearing a little bit about their story and then kind of some of their expertise. And I know you have a lot of expertise in worship leading. If you don't know Spencer, he runs Leading Worship Well at leadingworshipwell.com. Yes.
You got it. Yep.
Yes. And then Leading Worship Well on Instagram and everywhere. And I think everywhere. I don't know.
No TikTok. You've got the
No
TikTok.
TikTok.
I don't have TikTok.
I've got TikTok locked down. um, so yeah, you spend a lot of time training worship leaders and talking with worship leaders, and so excited to have you here with us. So, but to start us off, why don't you just tell us a little bit about kind of your story and how you got started leading worship?
Yeah. So I grew up in the church my whole life. I went to a church. I'm 27, so 27 years ago there weren't too many contemporary services around. So I grew up in sort of a traditional church, and then whenever I don't know what age I was, maybe 12 or 13, my family started a contemporary service at the church that we were attending. So my dad sang, my mom played keyboard, my brother played bass, my sister sang too, and I didn't do anything because I didn't know how to play an instrument. So I just sat there and watched them, but I came to like worship practice all the time. And then eventually one day my dad just randomly brought home a guitar for me and was like, here you go. And from there I just learned guitar, and I would sit in my room for hours at a time and strum it. And then eventually they asked me to join the worship team when I got to a point where I could do that. And so I played on this worship team for a couple years. And then the person in charge of the worship team left, or he stepped down from his
Yeah.
position. I don't think he left the church, but he stepped down from the position of worship team leader. And they came to me for some reason as a
Oh,
16-year-old, and they were like, Spencer, can you lead the worship team?
wow.
And I said yes. So I
Yeah.
was the praise team coordinator for a year before I went to college. And then I went off to college, led worship at college in the campus ministry. Decided that the college I went to wasn't necessarily for me. So I went back home. And when I moved back home, I started leading worship at a church plant in my hometown.
Gotcha.
And so I led there for 3 years and went to Liberty University online, got a degree in religion. And whenever I graduated, I walked into my pastor's office and I was like, hey, I'd love to be a part, or I'd love to lead worship
Mhm.
at this church, like as a full-time job. And we couldn't quite make that happen. I started off part-time, but he was gracious enough to make it happen. And it was a good position for like where our church was at. It was
Yeah.
growing and we kind of needed to fill that position. And I eventually moved into a full-time worship leading position. So that's my story of how I led worship.
Very
Started
cool.
leading
Well,
worship.
so what was it like? So when you getting started, what was it like leading with your family? Is that maybe it was normal since your family's always done it, but how is that different? Like leading your family versus leading with other people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my family's pretty close, so I feel like we have a good relationship. I think I don't know. I mean, I was at the end of the day, I feel like the more awkward part was that I was 16 years old
Right.
leading like this team of people who were of, I don't know what age they were at the time, but like
Right.
40 year olds, and
Right.
like 10 people on the team, and here I am. I don't really know what I'm doing, and they asked me to lead. So that
Well,
was
do you have any advice for someone like in that position? If someone's listening, they're going, actually, that's me. I'm 16. I'm 18. I'm leading all these people in their 40s and 50s. What do
yeah.
you say to that guy?
Number one, lead by example,
Mhm.
because it's really hard to, because I'm sure, like, especially if you're listening to this podcast right now or watching on YouTube or wherever this is going up, like, you care about improving your worship leading. And so you've probably got vision for your worship team. And maybe you look at some of the things Caleb does, or some of the things that I do, or some of the things that these other worship leaders you see on the internet do. And you're like, man, I want my team to do that. But here they are, like, they don't want to do anything differently. Like, if they're 40, they've probably been at that church for like 10 years, and maybe you just randomly stepped into the role and you want to change things, but they don't want to change things. So you got to lead by example, number one, and you have to set the precedent. Like, you've got to have your music memorized. You got to know your parts when you come into worship rehearsal. So that's the first thing. And then just like find a mentor, like even if it's somebody else at a different church, like say, I've been put in charge of this worship team and I would love some help, and I'd love to just meet with you like once a month or whatever it is. And just like, you don't have to do it on your own. It's okay. Find somebody to help you out.
Yeah. Do you have a mentor that you kind of walk with consistently at this point?
Yeah, well, we'll get into this story eventually, but right now I'm not leading worship anywhere.
Gotcha.
I've stepped down from my role as worship pastor about 9 months ago now. I like to say I recently stepped down, but
Right.
I keep saying recently, and the recently keeps getting further away. So it's been a nice break, but not currently. I don't have a mentor that I walk with, but I have a friend, Andrew, who's another worship leader, and we get together regularly. He's my age, and we're kind of in similar positions in worship leading. So it's good to just have somebody, even if it's somebody like who's right beside you. Obviously, it's helpful to have somebody who's got more experience than you, but even if all you can find is somebody else who's in the same position as you, like there's power in just talking because they understand where you're at. And then, of course, growing up, like in my worship leading role, I always had mentors. Like whenever I started leading the worship team at that first church, there was a guy it was actually the guy who had led the worship team before. He didn't leave the church. He just stepped down from the position because he was tired of leading, but he was like helping me along the way. So yeah.
Gotcha. Well, let's kind of shift gears a little bit here from kind of a little away from your story, more towards kind of still your story, but kind of more leading worship well. Um, you know, you talk with worship leaders all the time, and you're providing content for worship leaders all the time, videos, blog posts, all sorts of stuff. Are there certain pain points or struggles or things like that? Like, is there one or two struggles that seems to stick out the most for worship leaders?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if you think about worship leading, like there are a million different things that you have to do. I've kind of got I think about worship leading in three categories, at least whenever I'm creating content for worship leaders. So there's like the actual leading worship side of it, which is what most people focus on. And I feel like most people can get that part down because you're like, I can sit down, I can learn an instrument. Maybe I need help planning a set list or whatever. I think in that category, the thing that I hear the most is like, my church isn't engaging in worship. How do I get them to engage? And, I feel like I'm just up here playing a song and not actually leading people in worship. So there's that category. Then there's the worship team category where you're leading a worship team, which we kind of talked about already. Probably for that category, the thing that I hear the most is like, my worship team's not prepared. They don't care as much as I wish that they would care. And then the other one that I focus on is guitar playing, because I'm a guitarist. So, I mean, any problem you can imagine with guitar playing, I feel like it's just people who want to improve their guitar playing. They don't necessarily have a specific problem.
Yeah, that's good. What's what's kind of the first thing that you would tell someone if they're if they think their worship just doesn't care? Like, where would you point them first?
Yeah, well, you've got to raise up their understanding of what their role is, because most of the time when people don't take something seriously, it's because they don't think that it's important. Like,
Sure.
If something is important, you take it seriously. I think of maybe like your wedding day. If like you think your wedding is important. Now I'm not married. You're not married, so I'm just speaking out of
Right,
the
right.
blue here, but
Just get
weddings are important in my mind. So on a wedding day, you're going to make sure that everything is prepared, and you're
right,
going to make sure that like you've got all the details figured out because
right.
it's important. And so whenever your worship team is just like, hey, I'm the bass player. I
Mhm.
pluck some strings on Sunday mornings, or I'm a percussionist and I hit a drum on Sunday morning, or I'm a vocalist and I just sing background vocals and do harmonies. Like that in and of itself, that's not that important. Like
Right.
being a musician isn't that important, but when you can teach them that their actual role is that they're a worship leader,
Yep.
like that raises it from here to all the way up here. Like, no, we are called to lead the people of God in worship and worship God at the same time. So we want to bring our best for our church, and we want to bring our best for God because he's
Yeah.
worthy of it. So raising up your team's understanding of what their role is, I think, is really important, in getting them to take their role seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a church that I worked at one time. I had a drummer who, man, he played every week, and there were like I would try to get him to take weeks off. He's like, no, I just love playing. And one week he finally explained a little bit when he said, well, when I play here versus where I played other churches, when I play here, I'm not just a drummer. He said, there's more to it here. Like I get to lead people, I get to have a say in what we're doing. And it's so cool. And I, right then, like, I was like, I've done my job. Like,
Yeah.
I have done it right here. I was trying to pick out, different things that I've done. Like, what have I said in vision casting to make him feel that way? What have I said, just in our rehearsals and on Sunday mornings to make him realize that? 'Cause, yeah, I think that's super, super important.
Yeah.
That's cool. Um, let's see. Lost where I was in my questions.
I think
Well,
just to add on top of that, like how do you raise up your team in that role?
yeah,
Like you did things that made him feel that way. So like what are some of the things that you can do? And I heard it in how you said he responded. Like incorporate people into the decisions that you're making. Like don't just make it, here's some sheet music, or people don't use sheet music, but here's some chord charts,
right.
and like learn your part and show up on Sunday and play it. Like no, have them included in like, where do you think this service should go? Like include them in the planning process. I think
Yeah,
that's that's good.
that's awesome. Let's see. What are some other ways that worship leaders can continue to develop their teams? As to help them see themselves as worshipers. Like obviously, you just said add them into the planning process, things like that. But what can someone do week in and week out to develop musically or spiritually?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of having a great structure for your worship rehearsal. I
Yeah.
feel like it all starts with worship rehearsals because that's your time to pour into your team. And I know, like, it always blows my mind when some teams are like, we just show up on Sunday morning and we play. Like, there's not even a run through of the
Right.
songs. Like, to me, worship, like leading worship, is more important than that. Even if I can't get together with my team throughout the week because we're a portable campus and we don't have anywhere to practice or whatever it is, like I can show up an hour early on a Sunday and run through some songs, or I can even like get together with my team for 2 hours or however long a worship rehearsal is during the week. And then you've got this structure where you focus on not just the musical side of things, but also the spiritual side of things. So I've got a video on my YouTube channel called "How to Run a Worship Rehearsal" or something. I'm horrible with remembering the names of my YouTube videos, but just type in "worship rehearsal." You'll find it on the Leading
I'll
Worship
try
Team
to link
YouTube
it
channel.
somewhere in the notes or something on this.
Awesome. In the cards, I'll point right here, and you'll put a card up there.
Up
I
there.
believe in you. I guess you can link my videos. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's
Come
5 main parts to a worship rehearsal, and I think they're really important. You've got to have them down. I won't cover them here because I don't think we have time for them, but just like focusing on, you've got your run through of your songs. That's what everybody thinks about. That's how you develop your team musically. And you
on.
sit down and listen to recordings of past services with them and get them to see where they can improve. But then you've got like your devotional time too during your worship rehearsals. It can't just be all about music. Like you've got to have that spiritual piece so that they understand, like we talked about before, that they're more than just musicians, they're worship leaders.
Awesome. What's since I know you have a resource for this, what's a good place for people to start with leading their teams spiritually?
Yeah. Well, since you're going to tee it up like that, I actually, as of recording this podcast, I just released a devotional for worship teams called We Are All Worship Leaders. So that's why I'm so passionate about it and actually feel like I know what I'm talking about right now. I just spent the past couple months writing it. So if you want to check that devotional out, you can go to leadingworshipwell.com/we are all worship leaders. And it talks about all of the things that we just talked about. So like when your team realizes that they're a worship leader, they're able to prepare for worship well, serve your church well, and ultimately lead worship well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that. Definitely go check that out if you're listening. Yeah, I'm with you on rehearsals. I think that's the most crucial thing for worship leaders and worship teams, because you have an hour together, or an hour and a half together, and that's where you can just pour into your team. You can really serve your team well in those moments if you're prepared, and if you find the resources to do it. It's an incredible tool that we have, and I think a lot of times, yeah, we miss out on the opportunities we have just because we didn't think about it before we got there.
Yeah.
What we thought about was singing these songs, playing Lion and the Lamb for the 100th time, and and moving on. So, well, what's a way that you, as a worship leader, as a kind of a trainer for worship leaders, as a devotional writer, how do you continue to develop yourself personally?
Yeah, you sent me these questions in advance so I could think about them a little bit. And that was one that I had to think about because I don't know, like it's interesting. I'm sure you found, as being somebody who creates resources for worship leaders, to be able to stay resourced yourself. And I was just thinking about like my worship leading journey, and even leading worship well on top of that, and like how I started off in my worship leading journey. And I was looking up to guys like you see on YouTube, Brian Wall on worship tutorials, and Jake from Churchfront, and Chad from Worship Leader Hangout, and all of the other worship leader YouTube channels. And like to be listed as a resource alongside them now, which I'm not even like that big of a YouTube channel, but just to have that privilege of like, I see it occasionally where my name is mentioned with them, and I'm like these are the guys that I looked up to and still look up to be resourced to lead worship. Like I still watch their videos and follow along. So I watch YouTube videos just like the rest of you who want to be resourced to lead worship. And I read blogs. Like I'm a big Carey Nieuwhof fan. I love like the leadership part of leading worship, because it's not just about the musical side of things. So there's that. But then I was thinking too, like in the act of creating content, I feel like I am being resourced, because if you've read my posts before, I always do like points because that's how my mind works. But I don't just instantly have like these 3 points of how to run a worship rehearsal or how to plan a set list. Like I sit there and I think about them for a long time. So like the act of creating resources for worship leaders, I feel like in and of itself has resourced me to lead worship better. And I was even in an interview. I said I recently stepped down from a position, and I was in an interview for a worship leading position recently, and they were asking me, like they were throwing these questions at me, asking me like very specific questions about my philosophy behind worship leading. And I just feel like I had an answer for them because I had created content around it. So like those posts that I wrote, like they popped into my head. So if you want to be resourced to lead worship, number one, keep listening to podcasts. watch YouTube videos, read blogs, whatever, but then go teach somebody too. Like there's somebody in your church who you can raise up as a leader. And whenever you're a teacher and you're teaching somebody something, you have to know that content
Yeah.
well, because you can't just like, people know if you're making stuff up. Like you have to actually learn it to teach it. So
Right.
find somebody to teach if you want to be resourced.
Yeah, no, I've found the exact same thing, that for me, it's in the act of just evaluating the way that I do things. Because a lot of what we do in, blog posts and videos, just put words to, in some cases, what people already do, or some best practices. We're just finding good ways of phrasing it. And so I've found that if I just take a minute to reflect on my rehearsals and try to write, a couple hundred words about my rehearsal from last week, and go, okay, here's what I did really well, and here's what I did poorly. And then that's 2 blog posts right there,
Yeah.
But it also, it gives you language and gives you a way of talking about things and helps you to think more clearly in the future. That's great. It's really great. What's your number one piece of advice? You may have answered this at the beginning, actually, but what's one of your number one piece of advice for a new worship leader, say somebody who's been leading for less than a year?
Yeah. I think just leading as much as you possibly can.
Yeah.
I think that's, if you're a year in, like there aren't any tips and tricks for you that are going to be like, oh, now I'm a worship leader and I'm like leading really, really well. Like, no, you've got to put in the work. It doesn't just happen instantly. So you've got 52 Sundays out of the year to lead worship potentially. I don't recommend leading 52 Sundays every year. Take some Sundays off. But
Right.
I'm just saying, potentially, you've got 52 Sundays a year, plus any opportunities outside of that if you're younger, like a youth group or any other events going on at your church. So just get plugged in and lead as much as you possibly can, because there's no substitute for experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely no substitute for experience. So in the last, let's see, in the last 9 months, you haven't been leading worship every week. You've led worship once or twice in the last few months, right?
Yep, I led worship at the church that I interviewed at, and I'm actually about to lead worship there. I'm going on vacation this week, and then whenever I get back, I'm going to be leading there for 6 weeks in a row. So
Oh, wow.
it'll be interesting, like a long worship leading position.
Yeah.
Position isn't the right word, but opportunity to lead for 6 weeks in a row after I haven't led consistently for 9 months.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what are you thinking kind of going into that? Is there like certain, trying to think how to phrase this question. How are you feeling going into that? Going into, leading, for 6 weeks in a row after not being on stage for, months. Are there things that you used to do that you don't think you'll do anymore? Things that you haven't done in the past that you think you will do? Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. I think I'm just ready to lead again. Like 9 months break is a long time from not leading worship consistently, and so I'm thankful that I've had leading worship well. To like, I'm still super engaged in worship leading, and I'm doing worship guitar tutorials and covers. So like, I've got the music side of things covered, and then just constantly thinking about what it means to lead worship. So a few things that I'm thinking about going into leading this church is, like, number one, whenever I led there before, I just led for a week. So whenever you just show up one Sunday, you can only do so much. Like
Right.
beforehand, I asked them what songs are working well in your church. Like, I want to lead songs that people in your church know. And I'm really glad that I asked that question, because they gave me like 4 songs that they know work well in their church. And I did those 4 songs. And guess what? Like, people responded, and I
Right.
didn't have to guess, well, if I do this song, are people actually going to know it? No, you can just ask in advance. So that's leading one Sunday. Now for this like 6 Sunday set, I feel like I have room to do so much more to like actually develop relationships with the people that I'm leading, which I think is the most important thing you can do whenever you're leading worship, is to actually know the people that you're leading. So maybe I get to figure out some of their stories and figure out like where they're coming from. And then in that, I get to pick songs around what's going on in the life of the church, which I already know some things going on in the life of the church, and that gets my wheels turning whenever I'm picking out songs and crafting speaking transitions. So that's
Yeah.
kind of what I'm thinking about headed into this next 6 weeks.
Yeah, and you just touched on so many keys to, really effectively leading and pastoring in a worship position. I don't want those to just kind of, fly by, but you talked about getting to know people in your church, building those relationships, choosing songs that have to do with what's going on in your church. I think that's something we miss all the time because we're just going with that song's cool or that song's easy or whatever, instead of going, okay, there's a lot of people who need healing in this church. Well, let's sing songs about healing. Let's pray for healing. Let's worship God for his healing power. I think those things are key to leading well and to really engaging people in worship and engaging people with Jesus. That's cool. Didn't want anybody to miss those.
Good. I'm glad you pointed them out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what is the in this kind of odd season we're in the world, what's something that you have learned just in the last year or so, in worship, out of worship, as a Jesus follower, kind of anything at all?
Yeah, I'll just tie it into everything that's going on in the world right now. Like obviously coronavirus is going on, and so we haven't been able to meet with our churches. And for a while there, maybe we weren't meeting with anybody because we were locked down in our houses. I feel like that's starting to lift a little bit. But thinking about that, and then thinking about my last 3 years in full-time ministry and combining them together, I feel like I've really seen the importance of relationships, like in life in general, because not meeting with anybody consistently for 2.5 months or however long it was when we were locked down, like I recognized the importance of relationships in that time. And now that things have opened back up, like my life group at my church, like my small group, we've been getting together every week, where we were just getting together every other week because we know that relationships are important, and we missed that during that 2.5 months period. And then from the worship leading side of things, like I said, getting to know the people of your church. I look back to those 3 years that I spent as a worship leader, and I'm like, I just wish that I would have spent time getting to know the people of my church better. Like not just on Sunday mornings, but pouring into them throughout the week. I feel like I got so caught up in all of the things that I had to do, like the services that I had to plan, the Bible studies I had to plan. I was preaching occasionally at my church, and like there were so many logistical things to do, but none of those things matter if you don't have a relationship with the people of your church. If you're just like locked in your office all day, never talking to anybody, and then you step up in front of them on Sunday morning to lead them, but you've never built a relationship with them, they don't care about all of the things that you did or all of the work that you put in during the week. Like they want a person to lead them, not just like a machine that did a bunch of things for them. So the importance of relationships is what I've learned.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge. Well, man, we got to wrap it up. But before we do, tell people one more time where they can find you and find We're All Worship Leaders, and anything else that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, you can find me pretty much everywhere but TikTok. So I'm on.
You're missing out.
Maybe I'll get on TikTok soon. You can find me on Instagram at Leading Worship Well. That's where I spend most of my time. I love Instagram. Facebook, you can find me there, Leading Worship Well. Find me at leadingworshipwell.com. You can find me on YouTube, Leading Worship Well. Just type in Leading Worship Well wherever you want to find me, and I'll probably be there, except for TikTok. And I'll point you to something free just because I can. So I put together a free audio training called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading.
Cool.
And so we were talking about how to improve your worship training. or your worship leading. And so if you want to improve your worship leading, you can check that out. I'm looking for the link for it right now because I haven't talked about the training in a while, but it's leadingworshipwell.com/free audio training sign up. If you go to that URL, you can check it out. Maybe Caleb will link it in the description below. And it's a podcast where I cover 5 tips that they aren't hard to do, but if you just know them, they're probably good for beginner worship leaders. If you just know them and make the effort to do them, then I believe that they'll instantly improve your worship leading. So check that out too.
Awesome. Absolutely. Check that out. Well, thanks again for being here. Guys, go check out Leading Worship Well, and we'll see you next time.